We often walk around thinking of identity as this solid, fixed thing inside us, right? Like a core personality that's just, well, static.
Something you just have.
Exactly. We have it defines us, kind of the end of the story. But what if who you are isn't just a state you possess, but something you're constantly um, doing?
Oh, okay.
Something you build, negotiate, maybe even reshape piece by piece, not just in those big life-changing moments, but in every single conversation. Even like the totally mundane chat about the weather.
Right.
That's the absolutely fascinating idea we're taking a deep dive into today.
It really is a fundamental shift in perspective, isn't it? It moves us away from that, traditional view of identity as some kind of internal essence.
Yeah, completely.
So this deep dive is all about exploring this concept of identity as something that is actively constructed, made, done, performed.
I like that.
In and through discourse. It's the idea that the language we use, the way we interact, the specific words we choose, the stories we tell, even like the gestures that go with our talk, these aren't just ways we express some pre-existing self that's already in there.
Right.
Instead, they are the very tools, the materials, the actual locations where that sense of self is formed and negotiated and practiced, in real time.
That's the core idea, and it's such a powerful one. Our source material for this deep dive is a really insightful chapter that lays out this discursive approach to identity construction. It pulls together ideas from, well, language studies, sociology, psychology, and it really challenges those traditional, maybe more essentialist ways of thinking about identity.
It provides a pretty robust framework, I think, for understanding how something as complex and, personal as identity isn't solely an internal psychological process.
No.
It's profoundly shaped by our interactions with the world and, crucially, with the people around us, all through language.
And specifically for you listening, maybe you're diving into the world of elementary education and you've got this growing interest in psychology.
Yeah, this is super relevant.
Absolutely. This perspective offers a particularly valuable lens. If you understand that identity isn't just something kids have, but something they are actively building, like moment by moment in their daily chats and interactions.
With each other, with you.
Exactly. It can fundamentally change how you observe and understand the students in your future classroom. You'll start to actually hear the identity work happening right there on the playground or, during group work.
Yeah, you'll pick up on things you might have missed otherwise.
And the source material even includes a really detailed example of teenagers talking, which is incredibly relevant for seeing these identity processes in action. Even if the specific topics are different from younger kids, the process.
The underlying mechanisms are quite similar. It really offers a way to interpret the social dynamics and the individual struggles with self-definition that you'll inevitably see playing out in a school environment. It's kind of a framework for listening differently.
Okay, so let's unpack this idea then. Identity being constructed in discourse. The source makes it really clear that to see this process at work, we need to look through like two interconnected lenses.
Right.
The lens of discourse and the lens of construction.
Precisely. The core move is away from that essentialist perspective, asking, what is identity? As if it were, a fixed property or some unchanging core.
Like trying to pin down a butterfly?
Kind of, yeah. Instead, we adopt a constructionist view, asking, how is identity done? How is it made? How is it practiced?
So instead of looking inside someone for their identity, we're looking at what they actually do and say.
Yes. Identity isn't just residing passively inside you, waiting to be expressed fully formed. It's something you are actively performing and negotiating pretty much all the time through your language and interaction.
Performing. That implies action.
It does. And because this process happens in communication, it's observable. It's something we can actually study by looking closely at talk and interaction.
That observability is key, isn't it? It means we're not just guessing at internal states, but we're analyzing actual practices.
Exactly.
So first lens, discourse, the source gives us a working definition, and it's a broad one. It's not just the words themselves, is it?
No, it's much more than just grammar and vocabulary or even whole sentences looked at in isolation. The definition used here sees discourse as talk, text, and, importantly, other communicative means used in context.
Other communicative means?
Yeah, so it's not just what is said, but how it's said, and critically, the sequence of turns in a conversation, the specific setting, and, importantly, multimodal aspects.
Multimodal, you mean like body language, gestures?
Exactly. Gesture, gaze direction, intonation, body posture, even choices about, say, clothing or hairstyle can be part of this broad definition of discourse because they all contribute to meaning-making in interaction.
Wow, okay.
The source emphasizes that discourse is larger than the sentence. If you think about the roots of the word discourse, dis meaning in between, back and forth, and career meaning to run.
Ah, like current.
Right. It suggests this dynamic running back and forth, not just within the structure of the language itself, but crucially, between speakers in conversation.
Like the flow of ideas back and forth, or how different parts of what someone says kind of weave together to create a sense of who they are in that moment.
Exactly. And this meaning, this sense of self, isn't just inherent in the words alone. It's constructed through human action in time and space, taking into account how it was said, why it was said in that particular way, and where and when the interaction took place. It's all deeply contextual.
Got it. So that's the discourse lens, the rich, situated language and interaction we engage in constantly. Now, the second lens, construction. What does adopting a constructionist framework add to this picture of identity?
Okay, so the constructionist framework the source draws on, which has roots in sociology and philosophy, basically suggests that many phenomena we typically think of as fixed or inherent.
Like identity.
Yeah, or intentions, emotions,
Mm.
things that seem internal, but also external concepts like, say, marriage or money or nationhood.
Things we take for granted as real.
Right. Their reality isn't inherent. It actually comes from what are called intersubjectively reached agreements.
Intersubjectively reached agreements.
Mhm.
Okay, that sounds a bit academic. Can you break that down?
Sure. It basically means that these things aren't real just because I personally decide they are, or because they have some objective physical existence out there. They are real because we collectively, as a society or within a specific community or culture, agree they are real, and we behave accordingly.
Ah, okay. So our shared understanding and our practices actually constitute their reality.
You got it.
So identity isn't real just because I feel I'm a certain way inside, but because the ways I talk and act and how others respond to me collectively create and reinforce that sense of self within a kind of shared understanding.
Precisely. And importantly, these collective agreements are never completely fixed or static. They're always subject to constant renegotiation.
Always changing, subtly or not so subtly.
Right. And discourse, our communication and interaction, plays the absolutely central role in that ongoing negotiation process.
So the two lenses merge beautifully here. Discourse is both the tool we use and the site, the place where this construction and constant renegotiation of identity happens.
Exactly.
We use language to propose who we are, others respond, and together, often implicitly, we build and adjust our sense of self and belonging.
That's the core move of this discursive approach. It emphasizes the process of becoming, the fluidity, and the essential social negotiation involved in identity.
Yeah.
It's not about discovering some fixed internal state, but about a sense of subjectivity and self that emerges and is maintained or changed in dynamic interaction.
This is starting to feel much more dynamic, much more alive than the idea of identity just being a static box inside you.
It is.
And the source introduces this idea that the constructive process isn't always smooth sailing. It often involves navigating what they call dilemmatic positions or pressing dilemmas.
Yes, that's a really key concept. Identity construction through discourse isn't just about expressing a stable self. It's frequently about grappling with inherent tensions, these fundamental balancing acts that people navigate in their talk and interaction.
Balancing acts.
Yeah, the source highlights 3 key dilemmas that are particularly central to this process, which we should definitely dig into.
Okay, but before we get to those fascinating dilemmas, the source makes another crucial distinction about discourse itself that helps us understand the different layers at play. The idea of capital D versus small d discourse. This feels important for understanding the context, the bigger picture in which identity gets built.
It is. It's a really useful distinction, originally from the linguist James G., and the source adopts and builds on it. It helps us differentiate between the broad societal context and the specific moment-by-moment details of communication.
Let's start with capital D discourse. What does that capital D signify? Big D.
Right. Capital D discourse, with the big D, refers to broader societal forms of life, thought systems, or ideologies. Think of it as the ingrained, often taken for granted ways of being and talking that are dominant in a society or culture.
So the big picture stuff.
Exactly. These are the macro-level contexts, things like cultural norms, institutional conditions, widely shared belief systems. They frame and often constrain who can say what, how they can say it effectively, and under what circumstances something will be considered, valid, true, or appropriate.
Like the big overarching ways society talks about and defines things like gender or race, nationality, social class, maybe even what counts as success or intelligence.
Precisely. These are powerful, widespread discourses that definitely shape our understanding of ourselves and the world.
So theories like Foucault's, maybe, they look at this level.
Yeah, theories like those from Michel Foucault or Jürgen Habermas tend to focus on how these large-scale capital D discourses shape and constrain identities. From this perspective, individuals are seen as kind of drawing upon or using existing repertoires, ways of talking, acting, and being that are, in a sense, provided or even imposed by the culture and its institutions.
So from that viewpoint, your identity is significantly influenced, maybe even patterned, by the big societal narratives, expectations, and norms you encounter throughout your life, like scripts you're supposed to follow.
There's a strong emphasis on the power of those macro-level influences, yes. Now, contrast that with small d discourse.
Small d discourse with the little d.
This refers to the actual, specific choices made in language use in concrete, local, in-the-moment contexts. This is the performance, the actual words spoken, the specific sounds made, the grammatical structures used, the intonation patterns, the gestures that accompany speech.
Even clothing you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, even relevant clothing choices in that specific interaction can be part of small discourse. It's the micro-level detail of how people talk and interact in a specific situation.
This is where the actual identity practices are empirically observable, as the source puts it, the real moments of doing identity work.
Yes. Analytical approaches rooted in linguistics and interaction studies, think conversation analysis, for example, often focus intently on these specific, observable choices in local contexts. They analyze how speakers use these small elements to make sense of their immediate surroundings, manage the interaction, and crucially, to present a sense of who they are in that moment.
Okay, so we have the big, often invisible societal scripts and expectations, capital D, and the actual moment-by-moment ways we use language and interact, small d. The source mentions there's an existing tension between these two perspectives.
There is, and it kind of relates to that classic question of agency versus structure. Is agency primarily constrained by these macro structures? Does the influence flow mostly from capital D down to shape our small d actions? Or is agency exercised primarily in those local interactions, with our small practices then contributing to constituting, reinforcing, or maybe even subtly challenging those broader capital D phenomena?
Does the influence flow from small back up to capital D?
Like, are we just acting out parts written by society's big stories, or are we, through our everyday performances, actually rewriting those scripts, even just a tiny bit?
Exactly that. It's that fundamental structure versus agency question applied to discourse and identity. And the source argues that this tension, rather than being something you have to resolve by picking one side, is ultimately a productive one. It highlights that identity construction isn't just about being shaped by global conditions or solely about individual local action. It involves constantly navigating between these big picture influences and our specific actions in the moment. It's a dynamic back and forth. Okay, this is where it becomes incredibly relevant for you listening as a future elementary teacher. Think about your classroom.
Yeah, definitely.
You will absolutely have students who are growing up within and being influenced by broader societal norms and expectations, capital D, about things like, what girls or boys are supposed to be like, what games are okay, what counts as being smart or good, or how to act in different situations.
Absolutely. Those macro-level discourses are present in the school environment, in the curriculum, the books they read, the media they see, and they certainly shape peer interactions and expectations.
Totally. And then you'll see these students in their small group work, their playground games, their chats at lunch, in how they phrase a question to you or negotiate with a friend. That's all small discourse.
Right.
They are actively using language, body language, all these communicative means to position themselves within or maybe outside of those bigger discourses. They might use specific language choices to align with a peer group shaped by capital D norms, like saying, "We don't play that anymore, that's for babies." Or maybe they subtly push back. "It doesn't matter if I'm a girl, I can still play soccer."
Yes. Listening to how they talk, the specific words they use to describe activities, how they categorize themselves and others, the tone of voice, their gestures when they're trying to include or exclude someone, that can offer profound insights into how they are grappling with those broader societal categories and expectations.
You're seeing the back and forth between the big picture and their local attempts to figure out where they fit in, what's possible for them, who they want to be.
So understanding this distinction helps you see both the powerful backdrop of societal influences and the micro-level identity work kids are constantly doing through their everyday interactions.
It provides a really powerful analytical lens for observing the social world of the classroom.
It really does. And it's precisely in navigating that complex space between the big picture and local action that people manage those inherent identity dilemmas we mentioned earlier.
Ah, the dilemmas. Okay, let's get into them. The source highlights 3 key balancing acts, or pressing tensions. This is where the process of identity construction gets particularly interesting because it's about navigating these fundamental human challenges using the tools of discourse.
Yes, these are crucial tensions that are constantly being managed, often unconsciously, in talk. The first dilemma they discuss is around agency and control.
Agency. Okay, so my ability to act, to make things happen, to influence my world. The source frames this as the tension between the I, a subject, the feeling that I'm constructing my own world,
Right.
and the me as undergoer, the feeling that I'm being constructed by the world or that things are just happening to me.
Exactly. Are you the driver of your own life and actions? Or are you more of a passenger reacting to external sources? How do we communicate that sense of self, of being in control or not, in the way we talk about ourselves and our experiences?
And how does our language, our small discourse choices, show us navigating this?
Well, discursive choices, even seemingly tiny ones, can explicitly mark agency. If someone consistently uses language that portrays events as simply happening to them, where they are the grammatical object or the narrative recipient, the undergoer of an action, that's low agency marking.
Like using passive voice, the window was broken.
Yeah, or saying things like, it just happened, or the test made me fail, or things got out of hand.
So instead of saying, I dropped the ball, you say, the ball just got away from me. Less responsibility there.
Exactly. This positioning can frame someone as less responsible, maybe even as a victim of circumstances. Contrast that with high agency marking, using active verbs where you are the subject, emphasizing intentionality, taking credit for actions.
Like, I decided to try again. I built this myself. I chose to do X.
Right. This positions someone as a self-constructor, someone who is strong, decisive, and in control of their actions and maybe even their destiny.
The source uses the really compelling John Edwards example here, the U.S. politician and his affair.
Yes. This is a powerful illustration. When he was interviewed after the affair became public, the source analyzes how he navigated this agency dilemma through his language choices. Initially, when talking about his background and his rise in politics, he presented himself as highly agentive, a hardworking young man dreaming of doing something useful, emphasizing his own effort, his choices, his goal-directed actions.
So high agency there, positioning himself as someone who did things, who made his own way.
But then, when talking about the circumstances surrounding the affair itself, he shifts his linguistic positioning quite dramatically. He uses language that marks himself as being swept into popularity, as someone whose head was turned by others telling him how great he was.
Ah, so external forces acting upon him.
Exactly, implying these forces were acting on him. This narrative shift linguistically marks him as losing his agency, becoming more of a me as undergoer, someone to whom things happened, rather than someone who made choices.
And the source points out how this linguistic shift makes him seem, well, less accountable for his actions. He's framing his transgression not as something he actively did, but as something that kind of happened to him because of these external influences like popularity and flattery.
Exactly. The close analysis of his specific language choices, the verbs, the sentence structures, how he assigns causality, reveals how he is actively, though perhaps not entirely consciously, navigating this fundamental agency dilemma in constructing his public self during a crisis. He's using discourse to try and reshape the narrative of his own culpability.
Okay, for you as a future teacher, this is absolutely fascinating to consider in the classroom context. How do children talk about their successes and failures?
Oh, constantly.
When a student explains why they didn't finish their homework, do they say, I couldn't figure it out? Which actually implies some agency, right? Focusing on their own process, maybe suggesting persistence is possible.
Right, I struggled with this part.
Or do they say, it was too hard, or the teacher didn't help me enough? That feels like lower agency, attributing the outcome to external factors.
Yes. Or when they succeed, do they say, I got an A, maybe focusing more on the outcome than the process? Or do they say, I worked really hard on this and I finally figured it out?
Much higher agency there, emphasizing effort and strategy.
Definitely. These language choices can give you profound insight into how a child is positioning themselves in relation to their learning. Do they see themselves as someone who can influence outcomes through their effort and choices, an agentic learner, or someone to whom learning just kind of happens, an undergoer of the learning process?
And that positioning, how they talk about it, can directly relate to their self-perception as a learner, their resilience when they face challenges, their motivation.
Absolutely. Observing these patterns and how they describe events, even small ones, can be incredibly telling. It's identity work happening right there in their talk.
It's the kind of subtle thing you might not even notice until you start listening for it through this particular lens.
Exactly. It changes what you tune into.
That's a really practical application. Okay, second dilemma. Difference and sameness. This is about balancing our need to feel unique and distinct as individuals with our equally strong need to feel integrated with and belong to groups and communities.
Right. How do we manage that? How do we create a sense of self that feels individual and differentiated from others while at the same time performing our connection to various groups we identify with? How do we balance that inherent human tension between uniqueness and communal belonging?
And Discourse is the primary site where this balancing act gets performed.
Absolutely. Our discursive choices are constantly signaling our position in relation to others. We use language to describe ourselves and others, and a key way we do this is through employing what discourse analysts call membership categories.
Membership categories, like labels.
Yeah, labels we use for groups of people, things like student, teacher, boy, girl, friend, soccer player, the kids who sit at that table, the smart kids, the kids who like video games, all those labels we use.
And the source mentions category-bound activities. What's that?
That refers to describing actions or behaviors as being typically associated with a certain category, saying things like, well, boys are supposed to like trucks, or only smart kids finish their work early, or that's something teachers do.
Linking actions to the category?
Exactly. These link actions or traits to membership categories and are fundamental ways we draw boundaries, explicitly or implicitly, between self and other, or define us versus them.
So by saying something like, I love reading fantasy novels, but they only read comic books, you're using language to position yourself as different from them, and maybe implicitly aligning yourself with a group that also reads fantasy novels.
Precisely.
Defining sameness with one group by highlighting difference from another.
You're marking affiliations, creating distance, performing belonging. The source uses John Edwards again here. When describing his background, he emphasizes being a small-town boy in North Carolina, came from nothing, worked hard.
Right, we heard that.
He's using these descriptors to align himself with a category of hardworking, humble, perhaps traditional people, emphasizing sameness with a specific valued group. But then, as we discussed with agency, he has to account for how his actions the affair differentiate him from the expected norms and values of that very group he claims sameness with.
So he's simultaneously claiming a core sameness, the hardworking, moral boy, but then having to use discourse to account for the actions that make him different from that ideal category he set up.
Yes, he has to explain the discontinuity while trying to maintain the claim of underlying sameness. And the source makes a really profound point here. Discursive perspectives show how the strict boundary we often assume exists between the personal or individual who I am inside and the social, the groups I belong to, is actually kind of dissolved in interaction. They're fused and become empirically visible together as situated interactive processes.
Wow, so personal and social aren't separate boxes.
Not in the doing of identity.
Yeah.
No. Whether sameness or difference is made more relevant in any given moment depends entirely on the specific situation and what is being negotiated through the talk.
This concept is incredibly relevant to your work in the classroom. Think about how children navigate peer groups and cliques.
Oh, constantly.
How do they use language to establish who is in and who is out of a game, a group, or a friendship? They are constantly talking about themselves and others, emphasizing shared interests. We all like playing Minecraft. Criticizing or excluding outsiders. Ugh, they're so annoying. They always ruin everything. Or using those category labels. She's one of the quiet kids. He's a troublemaker.
Those are all explicit examples of kids using language to navigate the same different dilemma. They're actively doing identity work, defining themselves by aligning with desirable groups, us, and differentiating from less desirable ones, them, creating and maintaining group boundaries, figuring out where they belong and where they don't.
So those seemingly simple conversations about shared interests or judgments about others are actually crucial sites where significant identity negotiation and social positioning are happening.
Absolutely. And as a teacher, being keenly aware of how language is being used to include or exclude, to label, to emphasize similarity or difference, can give you essential insight into the social hierarchy, the power dynamics, and the identity processes unfolding among your students.
You can see how they are using discourse to manage this balance between being an individual and belonging to a community.
It helps you understand the social undercurrents of classroom life, definitely.
Okay, third dilemma, constancy and change. This seems like the one that speaks most directly to the idea of a continuous self over time, even as we inevitably change.
Yeah, this is a big one.
How do we maintain a sense of being the same person despite constant shifts in our lives, or claim to have changed dramatically while still feeling fundamentally continuous? How do we bridge the gap?
This is a core philosophical puzzle of identity, right? And discourse provides a primary means for solving it in practice, day to day. This is where narrative, or storytelling, becomes particularly important.
Stories.
Yes, narratives are a key genre for navigating this dilemma. They allow speakers to construct a sense of self over time that balances the extremes of being rigidly, unchangingly the same, which would feel static or maybe even boring.
Right, no growth.
And undergoing radical, inexplicable, chaotic change, which would feel fragmented or incoherent.
So stories help us make sense of the timeline. We tell stories about our past experiences, how we got to where we are now, our personal journey.
Yes, and crucially, the way we tell those stories, the specific choices of discursive devices within the narrative, things like how we sequence events, how we describe actions, particularly those marking temporality.
Or like past, present, future tense.
Right, an aspect whether an action is presented as completed, ongoing, or habitual. All these choices help us construct our experiences as either indexing sudden transformative shifts or as gradual, continuous paths of development.
The source gives the example of coming out stories, right?
Right. A story about coming out as LGBTQ+ can be told as a dramatic, sudden transformation, a distinct qualitative leap from one state of being to another, perhaps involving a moment of sudden realization or a decisive act.
A turning point.
Exactly. Or it can be told as a continuous path, where the speaker emphasizes that their true identity was always there, perhaps just hidden, not fully understood, or waiting for the right time to emerge. I always knew deep down.
Ah, okay. So the telling shapes the understanding of the change.
Precisely. The specific language used to describe the timeline and the experience shapes how that fundamental change in self is understood and integrated into a sense of continuity.
And John Edwards, again, he seems to be a rich source of examples for this chapter.
He really is. He also navigated this constancy change dilemma quite explicitly. He claimed that his core self remained the same person he'd always been. Remember, the poor, hardworking boy with high moral values he presented at the beginning.
Yeah, the foundation story.
But his outside life, his circumstances, changed dramatically due to external influences, others' agency, the pressures of popularity, and he attributes his transgression to these external changes.
So he uses this narrative structure to construct constancy at his fundamental core,
Right.
while explaining the significant discontinuity in his behavior as being caused by things outside that core self. I'm still the same person inside, but circumstances.
It's a way of managing the contradiction. So narratives are how we linguistically weave together our past and present experiences to create a sense of continuity, even when there are significant shifts, changes, or contradictions we need to account for.
And the source makes an important distinction here between traditional biographical research, which might look at lengthy life stories as stable representations of identity over time.
Right, like getting someone's whole life story.
And what they call the small story approach.
Small stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the approach favored by the source authors.
What's the difference?
This focuses on how people use narratives, even very brief, seemingly insignificant ones, in vivo interactions, so in the here and now of everyday conversation,
Right.
to construct a sense of who they are in that specific moment.
Yeah.
It's less about eliciting a full life history and more about analyzing the quick anecdotes, explanations, or personal experiences people share in conversation, and how those are used to perform identity, connect past and present, and manage dilemmas for current purposes.
So it's about the doing of identity maintenance and change through storytelling and specific interactions, not just reflecting on the past.
Exactly. It's not just telling your full life story to a biographer, but those everyday anecdotes you share with friends about your embarrassing moment yesterday, the quick explanation you give for why you were late, the way you talk about what you were like as a kid.
Those little moments.
Precisely. These small stories, told in the flow of conversation, are where we constantly practice navigating that constancy and change dilemma in real time. We are integrating past experiences into our current sense of self for the listeners we are talking to right now.
Okay, thinking about elementary school again. How do kids talk about how they were when they were younger versus how they are now? You hear it all the time. When I was in first grade, I couldn't read chapter books, but now I can.
Perfect example. Or, last year I hated math, but my new teacher makes it fun and now I like it.
Those are perfect examples of small stories of change. They are constructing a narrative of personal growth and transformation.
Yeah. Or they might talk about how they've always loved dinosaurs, or how they're still best friends with someone from kindergarten, constructing a sense of continuity and enduring identity.
So how they explain changes in their interests, their skills, their friendships, their opinions, these are all moments where they are actively using narrative discourse to construct a story of their developing self over time.
They are practicing balancing the same and different across time using these small narratives right there in the classroom or on the playground.
So listening carefully to the small stories kids tell, even the brief ones, gives you a direct window into how they're figuring out their own personal history and constructing a sense of continuity or change.
It shows their identity work in action in a highly observable form.
Okay. The source also briefly touches on how researchers actually study this stuff. The different analytical lenses or tools used to look at discourse to understand identity construction. They mention a few different approaches.
Yes, they give a quick overview of some prominent traditions. For instance, stylistics and sociolinguistics often look at linguistic variation and stylistic choices, things like accent, vocabulary, grammatical patterns, and how they correlate with social groups.
How people talk differently in different situations.
Right. They study how people use these variations as signals of identification with or differentiation from particular social groups or cultures, but are sometimes called acts of identity.
Like how someone might switch between different ways of speaking depending on who they are talking to, positioning themselves differently in each context.
Exactly. Then there's membership categorization analysis, or MCA, which is a foundational branch of conversation analysis, CA.
MCA.
MCA specifically focuses on how speakers use those membership categories. We talked about age, gender, role, group affiliation, and category-bound activities in everyday talk to do identity work.
Right, the labels and associated actions.
Yeah. It looks at how participants orient to these categories and the expectations associated with them in the moment of interaction. The focus is very much on identity as something that is made relevant and accomplished in the local interaction, locally occasioned identity.
So MCA looks at the specific language people use to label themselves and others, and how talking about what those groups do helps build identity right there in the conversation.
Yes. How someone might say, as a teacher, I have to. Or kids these days. These are ways of invoking categories and positioning oneself in relation to them.
Okay. And conversation analysis itself, CA.
CA studies the sequential organization of talk and interaction, the precise timing of turns, how people start and end conversations, how they repair misunderstandings, the fine-grained detail of interaction.
The mechanics of conversation.
Kind of, while CA traditionally focuses more on interactional patterns rather than predefined identities. When combined with MCA, it powerfully shows when and how specific identities are made relevant and accomplished by participants in the moment. As they often say, identities are done.
It's about the interactional choreography of identity being performed moment by moment.
That's a good way to put it. And finally, they mention critical discourse analysis, CDA.
CDA.
This approach tends to view identities as being framed within and influenced by larger capital D political, ideological, and power-laden contexts.
Back to the big picture.
Right. It looks at how discourse might reproduce or challenge things like sexism, racism, or social inequality, and how participants' identities and the categories they belong to play a role in maintaining or disrupting these power structures.
So this connects back to that capital D idea, how broader power structures and dominant ideologies influence how identity is talked about, understood, and maybe even constrained.
Yes. But the source emphasizes that all these approaches, particularly those focusing on the details of small d discourse like MCA and CA, highlight the central importance of studying discursive practices.
The actual doing.
Yes, the actual observable ways people use language in context as the fundamental sites where identity is formed, maintained, and transformed. This is where the personal and the social fuse, becoming empirically available for analysis as situated in vivo interactive processes.
So for you in the classroom, while you might not be doing a formal MCA or CA analysis on your students,
Probably not recommended.
right, but understanding that these processes are happening constantly in student interactions and gaining even a basic awareness of how researchers listen for them makes you a much more attuned and insightful observer.
Absolutely. Recognizing how students use language to categorize themselves and others, how they describe actions in relation to those categories, how they use small stories to navigate their own history. This provides invaluable insight into the complex identity negotiation work they are constantly engaged in, often below the surface of what the conversation seems to be about.
You can learn to listen not just to what they're talking about, like the fight on the playground,
Right.
but how they're talking about it, the specific words they choose, the way they structure their explanations, who they position as having agency or not, how they mark difference or similarity.
It fundamentally changes how you hear their conversations, and it provides a window into their developing self-perceptions and their social world.
And the source gives us that fantastic, detailed illustration of the example of the 5 15-year-old boys in a group discussion. This is where we can really see this complex, discursive identity construction happening in the wild, with specific examples of these dilemmas being navigated.
This illustration is really the heart of the chapter's practical demonstration, I think. It's a transcript analysis, a conversation among 5 teenage boys, James, Ed, Alex, Mike, and Rick, and an adult moderator, part of a larger focus group.
Okay.
The topic that comes up is whether there are openly gay boys at their school. The detailed analysis focuses on how one boy, James, actively uses his talk to discursively construct and perform a heterosexual male identity within this specific social setting.
Okay, walk us through it step by step, following the source's breakdown, because this is where the theory really comes alive.
Okay, so the conversation starts, and the moderator asks about gay kids at school. One boy, Ed, expresses doubt that there are any openly gay kids. James immediately contradicts this, positioning himself as having more knowledge than the others. He says very directly, actually, I know a few of them.
Right off the bat, claims authority based on personal knowledge.
Yep. An initial move to position himself as in the know, maybe even sophisticated or well-connected, but almost immediately after saying, I know, he performs what analysts call a self-repair. He corrects himself mid-sentence.
Okay.
He changes I know to I don't know them, but I've seen them. The source analyzes this as a crucial downgrade of his claim to knowledge. Knowing suggests familiarity, maybe even friendship or acceptance, implying proximity to the category gay. Having seen implies mere observation from a distance.
Why would he immediately backpedal like that? What's the analysis?
The source argues that he's navigating the same different dilemma here, in a very sensitive context for teenage boys' sexuality. By downgrading from knowing to seeing, he's creating discursive distance between himself and the category gay.
Pushing it away.
Exactly. He wants to be very clear about his lack of close proximity, potentially to avoid being heard as someone who has gay friends, or maybe even more crucially for him in that group, to avoid being construed as gay himself. He's using language to explicitly mark his difference from that category.
Wow, that's subtle. Just correcting one word does all that identity work.
That's the power of detailed discourse analysis, looking at the small stuff. These small choices carry significant social weight. But then the other boys immediately challenge him.
They don't let it slide.
No. Ed and Alex push back on his claim to know just by seeing. Ed says, how can you tell just by looking at him? Alex adds, you can't really tell. They're challenging his basis for knowing and implying he might just be relying on stereotypes or prejudice, questioning his claim to authority.
They're putting him on the spot to justify his claim.
Yes. James responds, and the source analyzes his use of at the start of his turn. This often signals taking an extended turn, preparing to give a more detailed explanation to defend his claim.
Okay, he's gearing up.
Right. He then shifts from talking about plural gays to a singular he, focusing on a specific, but notably unnamed 11th grader. And he explicitly states, I'm not going to mention names.
I'm not going to mention names. What does the source say about that specific phrase? Seems important.
Very. The source analyzes this as a strategic, rhetorical device of explicitly not mentioning. By saying he won't name names, he displays discretion and sensitivity, positioning himself as someone who isn't just gossiping casually about someone else's identity.
So that relates to the agency dilemma, presenting himself as responsible.
Exactly. He's presenting himself as in control of the information and choosing to be responsible with it. But T, as the source points out, it also paradoxically creates anticipation. By marking the name as something worth not mentioning, he signals that the topic is significant or sensitive.
Which makes the others want to know.
Precisely. Which is exactly why the other boys immediately press him for the name. Yeah, who? He builds suspense while trying to appear sensitive. Clever, isn't it?
It is clever, yeah.
He then attempts to reestablish the authority that was challenged earlier. He mentions that he's in a class with mostly 11th graders.
Ah, giving context for his knowledge.
Right. The source knows that this serves to clarify why he might legitimately be more knowledgeable about an 11th grader than the other boys who are 9th graders.
Yeah.
This move helps validate his claim to having seen an 11th grader he believes is gay, bolstering his credibility and positioning himself as knowledgeable again, related to navigating the agency dilemma and presenting himself as a credible speaker.
Okay, so he's established context, shown discretion, defended his claim to knowledge. How does he actually provide the evidence he claims to have?
He introduces his witness, the purported source of his information. He describes a girl, notice, already a female, different from the boys, and characterizes her as very honest and nice, adding that her locker is conveniently right next to his, the unnamed 11th graders.
Okay, setting her up as credible and having opportunity.
Exactly. The source analyzes this. He presents this girl as a reliable, trustworthy source, honest and nice, whose physical proximity makes her observation plausible. He's essentially using her credibility to shore up his own secondhand account. He kind of hides behind her trustworthiness to manage his own presentation of agency and credibility.
And what did the honest and nice girl supposedly say or see?
She apparently said he talked about how he is gay a lot, and she also noted that he associates with a lot of girls, not many boys. These 2 points are presented as the empirical evidence.
Okay.
And James explicitly connects this back. So that's how I know. But as the source highlights, he's using constructed dialogue, reporting what the girl said, not quoting the 11th grader directly. He's relying entirely on this third-party account.
Right, it's hearsay, technically. But the source digs even deeper into why the witness being a girl is so significant here, right?
Yes, this is a critical analytical point, revealing the really subtle identity work going on. The source argues that the witness being a girl, and specifically a girl who wasn't even spoken to directly by the boys she observed, serves as a perfect buffer.
A buffer. What does that mean here?
Why a buffer? Because she is distinct from both James, the speaker, presumably heterosexual male, and the boy in question, presumably gay male, in terms of gender and potential romantic interest. She is positioned as neutral ground, someone outside that dynamic.
Ah, I think I see. By getting information about a potentially gay boy from a girl who is clearly not a potential romantic partner for either James or the gay boy.
James uses this narrative device to powerfully demarcate the difference in sexual orientation between himself and the boy being discussed. The female intermediary reinforces James's own heterosexual identity by providing evidence about the gay boy from a position that is explicitly not a potential partner for James either.
So it reinforces his differentness from the gay category.
Exactly. This strongly relates to navigating the same different dilemma, establishing and performing his heterosexual identity by creating discursive distance from the gay category, using the gender of his witness as a key tool.
That is incredibly subtle identity work happening just in the choice of who his narrative source is presented as being.
It really shows how deeply social and identity-laden, even seemingly minor conversational choices can be.
Yeah.
And the source's analysis of the sequencing of information is also quite insightful.
Sequencing. How he ordered things.
Yes. James places the detail that the boy associates with a lot of girls and not many boys near the very end of his story, in what discourse analysts sometimes call the slot of the coda, the concluding part.
Why does the placement matter so much?
Well, think about it. Had he started with that observation or put it earlier, it might have sounded like he was relying on a simple, perhaps prejudiced stereotype, leaning into a potentially problematic capital D discourse about what gay men are supposedly like.
Right, it could sound like, well, he hangs out with girls, so he must be gay.
Exactly. But by placing it at the very end, after he's presented it as evidence gleaned from a credible witness, so that's how I know, It allows him to use it as a concluding piece of information. It functions as something that helps epitomize the category of gays in this specific context, and then smoothly transition the conversation to a new related topic. Why do gay boys apparently hang out with girls?
So the sequencing helps him avoid sounding overtly prejudiced, even while using a potentially stereotypical observation by presenting it as a kind of neutral fact or observed behavior reported by the witness.
Exactly. It's a strategic use of narrative structure and sequencing. And this entire discursive performance, his initial claim, the self-repair, introducing the witness, describing her credibility, presenting the secondhand information, using the girl as a buffer, and the strategic sequencing of the evidence helps James draw up and position himself within the group boundaries of his peers, the group of presumably heterosexual boys he's talking with.
He defines his own group identity, us, the heterosexual boys, partly by defining who is not in it, them, the gay kids, using this whole story as the means to draw that line.
Yes, he draws a clear boundary between them and us. And notice how the responsibility for the gay boy associating mostly with girls is implicitly placed on them he associates with, not on us, the heterosexual boys perhaps not associating with him. This is strong work navigating the same different dilemma and performing group identity.
So in this one seemingly simple story, James is simultaneously navigating the agency dilemma, presenting himself as knowledgeable and discreet, the same different dilemma, distancing himself from the gay category and reinforcing his heterosexual identity via the girl witness, and even the constancy change dilemma implicitly by grounding his claim in observable facts presented by the witness.
Absolutely. The source summarizes that James's story accomplishes multiple things simultaneously through his careful discursive choices. He reestablishes his authority and knowledgeability when challenged. He fends off sounding gossipy or prejudiced by citing a credible, distant source. And crucially, he actively constructs and reinforces his heterosexual identity by enacting masculine norms and heteronormativity through the very way he tells this story and positions the characters within it.
Wow. This detailed example really brings the source's main point home with incredible clarity, doesn't it? Identity isn't some abstract thing floating around. It's something you do right here and now in interaction with real consequences for how you are perceived and positioned.
Yes, the source emphasizes that this sense of self, particularly Jones's performance of a heterosexual male identity in this instance, is an active accomplishment of the participants working in concert.
In concert. So the other boys play a role too by challenging him.
Absolutely. The boys challenging, James responding, all operating within shared understandings of categories and social expectations. It's achieved not just by what James said, but by how the story was situated and performed using those specific small d discourse devices in this specific local setting.
So the meaning, the identity work, emerges dynamically from the situation and the interaction itself.
Exactly.
Not simply from some fixed, pre-existing internal belief or prejudice that the boys might have held beforehand.
Right. It's interactionally achieved. And as the source notes, while these small practices are happening locally, they simultaneously reproduce or orient towards those broader capital D discourses, like prevailing heteronormativity or stereotypes about sexual orientation. It's the micro reinforcing the macro, or at least interacting with it.
It's that constant dynamic interplay between the global conditions and the local actions we talked about.
Precisely.
Okay, let's bring this back explicitly for you, the listener heading into elementary education. This detailed analysis of a teenage conversation might seem specific to that age group, but it shows exactly the kind of microscopic identity work that is happening constantly, even among much younger children. The topics might differ, but the process.
This level of analysis demonstrates the power of the discursive approach. While elementary school children might not be discussing sexuality, the underlying discursive processes of navigating these fundamental dilemmas, agency, same different, constancy change, using language to position oneself and others, are remarkably similar and happen constantly throughout the school day.
Think about how younger children use language to negotiate power and inclusion in play. I'm the leader. That's agency, right?
Definitely.
Or you have to do what I say. Attempting agency and control via a social role, how they define who is their best friend and who isn't. She's my best friend, so she gets to go first. That's navigating the same different dilemma and establishing group boundaries clear as day.
Yes. Or how they use category labels like kindergartner versus first grader to position themselves as big kids now, distinct from the younger ones.
Or how they describe another child as mean or nice, attributing fixed traits based on specific actions, positioning that child within a category. How they talk about who is good at drawing or the fastest runner often involves positioning themselves relative to others, managing that same different tension.
All the time. And there's small stories about what happened at recess, why they were sad, or how they built that amazing structure with blocks. These are all practices of navigating those dilemmas.
How they describe their own role in the block building. Did they just help, maybe lower agency, or did they build it, higher agency? Did they talk about how they used to not be able to color inside the lines, but now I can? That's constancy change right there.
Exactly. These are the everyday sites where identity is being negotiated. As a teacher, understanding that identity is a constructed process happening in these moments, and gaining even a basic awareness of the kinds of discursive work kids are doing, how they use labels, attribute actions, tell small stories, position themselves as agent or undergoer, can make you an incredibly insightful observer of their social world and their developing sense of self.
It allows you to listen beyond just the surface content of their conversations and hear the deeper identity work taking place. You're seeing the building blocks of self being laid down right there in the talk.
It gives you a different kind of literacy. In a way, the ability to read the identity work happening in the discourse around you.
Okay, let's try and synthesize what we've covered and think about the broader implications of this whole perspective.
Sounds good. So to recap, the core argument from this discursive perspective is that identity construction is an active, ongoing process. It involves navigating these three key human dilemmas through language and interaction. Agency, balancing being an actor versus being someone things happen to.
Actor versus undergoer.
Right, then same different. Balancing uniqueness and belonging, self and other.
Me versus ustabum.
And constant site change, constructing continuity over time despite shifts.
Being the same person across time.
And the power of this approach lies in analyzing those detailed small discourse choices. Looking closely at how people talk gives us deep insights into how identities are made relevant, performed, and accomplished in specific local contexts.
Yeah. The value is in the rich, descriptive detail and understanding the dynamic process, maybe even more than trying to make broad generalizations. This perspective shows us identity not as a fixed trait, but as something inherently dynamic, fluid, interactional.
And it really dissolves that traditional, sometimes rigid boundary between the internal personal self and the external social world.
Yeah, you said they're fused.
Right. They are fused and become empirically visible as situated, interactive processes in discourse. The quote, "Who am I?" isn't really answered in isolation. It's answered moment by moment, interaction by interaction, through the stories we tell and the positions we take.
And crucially, from this perspective, people aren't just passively having an identity imposed upon them by those big capital D structures, nor are they simply expressing some preformed internal self.
No. They are actively, interactively involved in negotiating, modifying, sustaining, and changing their sense of self by drawing upon and using the discursive means available to them in their specific social contexts. They are, as the source puts it, living their own constructions.
Living their own constructions. I like that. They draw on existing discursive resources, ways of talking, categories, narrative structures, but by repeating and reiterating these discursive performances over time, these practices gain durability.
You start to feel solid routine.
Yeah, and that can lead to the experience of having a stable, unitary self, like it's just there.
But from a constructionist view, even though they gain that durability and feel stable, those identity performances are ultimately looser, more negotiable, and more autonomously fashioned than traditional views of a fixed internal essence might suggest.
So there's always potential for renegotiation in the next interaction. It's not set in stone.
Exactly. The power and perhaps the fluidity of identity lies in the practice itself that's built and maintained through these repeated, often ritualized discursive performances in conversation. It's a constant process of doing.
Okay. For you heading into the classroom, this understanding is incredibly valuable. Knowing that identity is a dynamic, constructed process happening in discourse, especially in social interactions with peers and adults, can and really should inform how you approach teaching, classroom management, student relationships, pretty much everything.
It suggests that fostering positive identity development in students isn't just about telling them they are capable or talented, although that's important too. It's also about creating classroom environments where they feel safe to explore and negotiate different aspects of who they are.
Safe spaces for identity work.
Right. And paying close attention to classroom communication, how students talk to each other, how they talk to you, how you talk to them is vital because that language environment is actively shaping the identity negotiation happening right there.
Understanding these processes helps you appreciate the complex social and psychological work kids are doing all the time, work that is made visible in their everyday talk and interaction. You can listen for the clues.
It gives you that different kind of literacy we mentioned, the ability to read the identity work happening in the discourse around you.
So we've taken a really deep dive today into this fascinating idea that identity isn't just something you have, like a static thing inside you,
Right.
but something you are actively building and negotiating in every conversation you have, navigating fundamental human dilemmas like agency, belonging, and continuity using the powerful tools of discourse.
It's a view of identity as a continuous process of becoming, made visible through the lens of how we talk and interact with each other.
And as you go forward from this deep dive, whether you're observing students in a classroom, engaging in conversations with colleagues, friends, or family, or just reflecting on your own experiences, maybe consider this provocative thought drawn from the perspective we've explored today. Since identity is constructed in discourse and is constantly practiced and negotiated in interaction, how do your own everyday conversations, the specific words you choose, the stories you tell about yourself and others, how you position yourself in relation to the people you're talking to and the events you describe, how do those moments actively shape your own sense of who you are right here, right now?
Yeah.
How does the specific context of your interactions, the people you're with, influence the version of you that emerges and is performed in that very moment?
That's a really interesting question to keep listening for, isn't it? In yourself and in others.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.